Thank you for joining us for our video series exploring expertise in property marketing. Today, we're taking a deeper look at storytelling, and we have Michelle Santos, Senior Manager of Content at Colliers International, to offer some of her hard-won insights. Thank you, Michelle, for making the time to speak to us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I suppose we'll start with a bit more of a general question to get us into things. Are there overall best practices that are constant, that never change when it comes to storytelling and communications?
Yes, I find that no matter the time, no matter the circumstance, I always say there's always a story. Particularly in our industry, I've heard quite a few times when I'm speaking to our different experts and professionals, for example, when I'm trying to get to, what I call the juice, or, trying to, get into the deep dive of what I'm seeing as a story. And sometimes I get the response, there's nothing extraordinary about it. It's it's an ordinary occurrence, or that sort of response. And what I always say, well, there's always a story. For example, speaking about a listing, and I've said this, numerous times, where there's a reason somebody bought that property. There's a story behind that. There's a story now as to why it's available, why it's for sale. And there is a story as to why it's going to generate interest, why someone would want to then acquire that property. So there is always a story. And that is my job, in my role and as a storyteller, to get to the juice of that. And an analogy I always use is, think of whether it's a transaction, a project, a deal. Think of it as a coconut. When you see a coconut, it's pretty ordinary. If anything, it's actually kind of unattractive. It's got this weird, shape to it. It's got little like tufts of, whatever you call that, fibers coming out of it. But when you pick that up, you slice it, dig deeply, all this juice comes out, all this coconut juicy goodness. And that's my analogy for when you dig deeply, you'll get the juicy story there.
Excellent, thank you. Looking at coconuts in a whole new way. So that's obviously something that has stayed true and stayed the same over time, but everything does evolve. What changes have you seen, and what have you seen make storytelling more effective?
Yes, there have been lots of changes. So just to give some background here, and I might age myself a little bit here, when I first started my career, print was the main source of stories and information. I myself was an avid magazine reader. That's where I would get my insights and, seek out my stories. So, and that has changed. Not to say that, there's no room for print now, but there are many more avenues now to tell your story. You not only have print, you of course have, websites. And yes, when I started my career, we already had, e-commerce was booming, and websites were already a source for, so much information. So now we have print, we have websites, we have webinars, we have video, like what we're doing right now. You can tell a story in 280 characters or less, which is pretty amazing. So, but there is a caveat to that. With a lot more avenues and a lot more channels to use to tell your story, there's also a lot more competition, a lot more options for readers and for users to, get information. So you really need to, if you want to get your message across, your story across, you need to be effective. So is it making storytelling more effective? It's a real motivator to be effective.
That's fair.
Yeah. Another one is that, now there's an expectation to get stories and information really quickly. There's that instant gratification, because again, with all these avenues, right? It's like, well, what do you have for me? there's an expectation that, if I turn on my device, I expect that news, or that story feed. For example, thought leadership pieces, with that one, you do have more of a stage and leeway to really set it up. You'll, paint the picture, you'll include some research in there and really explain what the situation is. And then, resolution, conclusion, call to action. Quite different, for example, if you're telling your story through video. It's a lot more visual. And I've shared this with you before, Erin, where our soundtrack itself, which I love, tells a story as well. That's part of it. So it's a different means of telling your story. Again, you will have your beginning, middle, and end, but you're telling it in a different way. But at the end of the day, you're still telling a story. So again, just being mindful. There are many avenues, but make sure that you are tailoring your story to your vehicle and your audience. People are really seeking out information, as opposed to I'm going to feed you my story, which still happens. But now I find that people are out there. They're hungry for stories and they're hungry for information. So again, as storytellers, we need to be ready to feed them the story and that information, and we need to get it right. It's almost like, you really have one shot at it. And to add to that point, again, with all of these avenues and all these opportunities to convey the message, there's also an increased opportunity to, unfortunately, spread the wrong information and, inaccurate stories. When I first started, fake news was not a phrase in everyday language. So with it comes responsibility. So is it making storytelling more effective? Yes. But again, there's a responsibility of making sure that that story is accurate.
Absolutely. And that responsibility is something we hope is a trend that we'll see and continue. I agree.
Yes.
With all that in mind, the immediacy, the hunger for stories, the responsibility for accuracy, what is one big common mistake in communications that you see within our industry specifically that you just wish people would stop doing?
No, thanks for asking that. With storytelling, not just within our industry, but in general, I think a common mistake is to speak your own language as a storyteller versus speaking the language of your audience. And it's easy to go down that path. For example, in our industry, we have our own terms, our own jargon. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that when you're telling a story, whether it's through an article, through a video, through other means, even, through, a post, a 200 character post, for example, it's really important to ask yourself, how do I frame it and how do I convey it so that I'm going to reach the audience I'm trying to reach, and so that they will relate and they will understand, because really the point of storytelling is to convey a message. And if you're not understood, then that message is not going to get very far. So keep in mind, speak their language. Yes.
Not everyone is a commercial real estate professional.
Exactly. Right? Yes.
So maybe a bit of an add-on to that. What do you wish everyone would do to improve? Something that they could take internally, not necessarily avoiding mistakes, but improving their own communications, their own storytelling abilities.
Mm-hmm. It's also tied a little bit to what I had said earlier about speaking your audience's language. I think putting yourself as well in your audience's shoes goes a long way. Before you sit down and write an article, for example, before you sit down and storyboard, ask yourself, what what would I like to convey? But what would my audience want to hear? What would they want to see? And how can I best frame that so that I meet their needs, as opposed to, what can I do, write, or say so that I can say what I want to say?
That's wonderful and very helpful. Thank you so much, Michelle, for giving us this time today and sharing your thoughts. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Erin. You too.